Okay, so now we're starting with chapter 3, where we're going to talk a little bit about cells and go into a little bit of biology. So, the first thing that we have to discuss is what is a cell? Well, a cell is the structural and functional unit of basically all living things. All organisms have to be made up of at least one or more cells. So, the simplest organisms would be something like a single celled bacterium. And basically, the cell is the smallest unit of life. So, how well the entire organism functions is going to depend on the individual cells as well as the combined activity of all the cells in the organism, because different cell types have different functions. The structure and function, though, are complementary. So, biochemical functions of cells are going to be dictated by the shape of the cell and the types and numbers of the subcellular structures that they contain within inside. So the continuity of life has a cellular basis, and cells can only arise from other pre-existing cells. So if we're talking about our body cells, which are somatic cells, those arise from mitosis. We also have our sex cells, which are also known as gametes, and those are going to rise from a process called meiosis. So in AMP1, we'll talk a lot at the end of this chapter about mitosis and somatic cell division. And then when you hit the reproductive system in AMP2, we'll talk about how we produce our gametes, or our sex cells, through the different process, which is meiosis. So this picture is just giving you, basically showing you the diversity when we talk about cell structure. A lot of times people like to think of a cell and think of something spherical in shape, but in reality, just in our body alone, we have all of these different types of cells. Our fibroblasts actually look like fibers. That's why they're called fibroblasts. Our erythrocytes, these are red blood cells. They actually don't contain any organelles. They eject them once they become mature, and they have this biconcave shape to them. Epithelial cells, which we'll learn a lot about when we hit the different tissues that make up our body. And then our skeletal muscle cells are really elongated. Some are up to 4 meters long in our body. And because of that, we call them muscle fibers. We also have macrophages that have lots of projections extending off of the ends, and fat cells where we can see this right here is our nucleus is actually squeezed to the perimeter of the cell itself. Our nerve cell down here also has lots of projections and extensions off of it. So we have some dendrites right here. This is our soma, or cell body. We have a very long axon. And then we have our axon terminal down here. We'll talk more about the structure of nerve cells when we hit the nervous system. And then here is one of our gametes, which would be a sperm. And you can see its unique shape as well as it being a motile cell. So when we talk about a cell, your textbook divides it up into its three basic components. So we have the plasma membrane. This is the outer, basically, circumference of the cell, and it acts as a selectively permeable barrier. We also have the cytoplasm, which is basically everything inside of the plasma membrane, and it's going to contain intracellular fluid as well as organelles that can be suspended inside. And then within the cytoplasm, we also have the nucleus, and the nucleus is where we're going to house our DNA, or a nucleic acid that can basically contains all the genes that we need to encode any proteins. So eventually, by the end of this chapter, we will cover all of the three basic parts, their functions, and the functions and locations of all the different organelles within a cell. The last thing in this first section is going to be talking a little bit about extracellular materials. We're just going to briefly mention them here because our primary focus is what's going to be on inside of the cell. But when we're talking about extracellular materials, that's referring to everything that's found outside of the cell. We have three different classes of extracellular materials. The first one is the extracellular fluid. Sometimes you might see me abbreviate extracellular fluid as ECF. So things that could be considered extracellular fluid would be interstitial fluid. So, interstitial fluid is the fluid that lies between different tissues and different cells. We also have blood plasma, which we'll talk about later on, and that's going to be basically the liquid or solvent component of blood. And we also have cerebral spinal fluid that's going to surround both our brain and our spinal cord. The second class of extracellular materials are going to be the secretions that the cells are actually releasing. So things like saliva and mucus, or even those secretions that aid in digestion in our stomach and our small intestines. And the third class of extracellular materials is going to be the extracellular matrix. And this is a substance that's basically going to act like a glue that holds the cells together. So the most abundant extracellular materials actually going to be composed of proteins and polysaccharides.